Now I'm going to be talking about Elden Ring's approach to enemy design, specifically how enemies fare at the start of the game versus the mid-game and finally the end-game. To clarify, this section is going to be more focused on specific enemy behavior and analyzing how it is they interact with the player, as well as the consistency of enemy design across the game. The upcoming section regarding difficulty is where we'll finally begin assessing how the various design elements come together to form Elden Ring's overall difficulty. I hope that makes sense, and if it doesn't, you'll understand by the end. At a mechanical level, I find Elden Ring's enemy design on the whole to be rather poor. However, that's not to say there are no standouts or examples of genuine excellence to be found throughout the game. I simply find the overall roster of enemies to be very poorly balanced and implemented on average. But let's start by talking about Elden Ring's early game. Elden Ring's early game, that being the areas of Limgrave, the Weeping Peninsula, Siofra, and Stormvale, is something of a mixed bag in terms of quality and engagement. The majority of non-boss encounters typically consist of either very easy mobs or these sort of gotcha moments where the game will try and throw you a curveball to keep you on your toes. On paper, I think that's to be expected, and overall is a fine way to start the game out, as it helps to ease the player into the world while also making it a point to remind them regularly just how dangerous this world can be should the player not be mindful of their wandering. I actually think the enemy sets of Stormvale and Siofra are quite strong, being pretty damn tough on the whole, but never quite feeling impossible either. Even the toughest encounters manage to retain a glint of possibility to overcoming them, and I think if Elden Ring had managed to retain that feeling of hopefulness throughout the experience, while of course still properly escalating the difficulty, the final product would have been a lot better on the whole. And make no mistake, there are some genuinely difficult encounters in these earlier sections. Stormvale in particular is pretty damn tough and can very easily catch you off guard if you're not prepared. The enemy set for the early game is far from perfect though. There are several instances of enemy ganks just hounding the player into submission, which can feel pretty cheap. Of all the ways that Elden Ring could echo Dark Souls 2, this is by far one of the most infuriating, and honestly, it only gets worse as the game progresses. These regular swarms by the imp statues in the early dungeons, or getting bombarded by demi-humans in an already gank boss fight, are both pretty much on par with taking a hammer to your shin in terms of fun factor. I mean, at least the hammer to the shin releases endorphins after a while. Maybe someone out there likes these gank fights, and you know what? Bully for them, I say. But I find these kinds of fights, at least in Souls games, to be immensely unsatisfying because really all it comes down to is the same old strategy of either spamming crowd control attacks, or using divide and conquer in conjunction with attrition to slowly whittle the enemy force down.
Loveless, gank fights aren't very difficult. All you have to do is kite the AI and take them out one by one.
Alright, who is this guy? None of these are particularly satisfying strategies because spamming crowd control only requires the necessary weapon or spell and a well-timed swing or cast, and divide and conquer strategies like kiting are just tedious wrestling with the AI to slowly achieve a series of repetitive and small victories that otherwise would be much easier and take no time at all. I know I mentioned Stormvale being a solid dungeon with a decent enemy set, and I stand by that fully, but can we talk about these barrel-flinging cuckoo boom boom assholes for a moment? I really hate these things. Their dive bomb attack has really high tracking for some reason, and the mix of this tracking as well as their explosive barrels having a decently large radius make avoiding them much more painful than it really should be. They're also frustrating to try and hit even with ranged attacks thanks to their sporadic movement and their elevated positions. This means that the most efficient method for getting past them is simply to avoid fighting them altogether. But even trying to do that is frustrating due to the heavy tracking of their attacks. At this point with Elden Ring, I just find myself doing this weird crisscrossing dodge spam to avoid them because nothing else really seems to work, at least not consistently, and fighting them is just not fun, it's not enjoyable, it doesn't feel like it's testing any of my skills, it's just a really annoying fight that I don't want to engage with. I mentioned that the early game doesn't see much in the ways of especially tough enemies, and that's definitely true, but there's also the Great Rune Bears, which are among the least fair enemies this game has to offer, even in the late game, so as you can probably imagine, finding one as early as Limgrave can be pretty frustrating. Look, I'm just gonna say it, whoever designed this thing, you are an asshole. Like, who at the studio decided that Cocaine Bear needed to be put on steroids? Not only do these things possess humongous hitboxes and deal massive damage, as well as dishing out pretty rapid attacks, but they can also outrun Torrent, which might very well be one of the single dumbest design choices for any enemy across this entire game. It sucks. Unless you have a way to manipulate the aggro of these things or outright decimate them with an opening attack, coming out victorious feels like a complete and total crapshoot, and yes, that includes the late game. And trying to outrun them on Torrent basically requires you to have an environment that you can use to manipulate the AI, since, enemies can't jump, well, sometimes. The rune bears can't, thankfully. Then again, a lot of Limgrave is a pretty flat plane, so trying to get away from a rune bear that can outrun you and kill you most of the time in one shot, sometimes two. Yeah, let's just say this isn't the type of difficulty that you want to be flexing this early on. Rune bears and some annoying gank fights aside though, most of Limgrave and the Weeping Peninsula encounters feel strangely easy. Like, really easy. Most enemies here struggle to do any sort of real damage without a squad backing them up, and even the tougher enemies tend to be so slow that they can be dispatched with relative ease. Again, there are some exceptions, like the Rune Bear, which can literally outrun you no matter what, but it is important to remember that that is an exception, thankfully. I suppose the pumpkin heads can be kind of tough, sometimes. But aside from that, you're going to find yourself cleaving through a pretty large number of these low-level soldiers for a good while. Subsequent playthroughs, I would be surprised if you'd even remember to acknowledge them. But even with the early game's issues, it's not until we reach the mid-game that things really start to go downhill. Elden Ring's mid-game is mostly defined by 4 particular sections of the map, those being Caelid, Liurnia of the Lakes, Mount Gilmer, and Lindell Capital. Depending on your particular build and what order you approach these levels in, you can honestly find the game anywhere between laughably easy to being among the hardest games you have ever played, with the difficulty constantly fluctuating depending on where you go and at what point in your progression, what build you're using, and what level you are. It is that much of a crapshoot. I've played through Elden Ring with a dozen characters multiple times over by now, and not once has the difficulties of these areas ever felt remotely consistent. Of course, there is the factor of cumulative experience to consider, but even figuring out just how much of a role prior experience has played feels like a guessing game, given I've had both less and more trouble in certain areas and against certain bosses on successive replays. Up until my most recent playthrough, for example, I found Commander O'Neill to be a complete and total pushover, but because I've gone in with a fairly simple build and at a slightly lower level than usual, he's gone from being a complete cakewalk to completely annihilating me in no time flat with this particular character. Again, this may seem like a given due to my being a lower level, but you have to understand that prior to this, I'd never even died to this boss. And it's not as if I'm a stranger to going into fights in Elden Ring under level, just look at my first playthrough. So it was pretty jarring to say the least when Commander O'Neill of all bosses was suddenly giving me a hard time when I'd killed Margit and Godric with relative ease just an hour prior with the exact same character. I should also make it clear that I've built all of my characters to play rather distinctly from one another, but even with all of my experience, I genuinely cannot tell why it is looking back at my gameplay that there are times where it feels like I'm just being completely annihilated, and then there are other times where I'm utterly steamrolling the dungeon. It really can't be overstated just how unlikely it is that any 2 playthroughs will ever be the same. And while that may sound like a good thing at its face, after all, who doesn't appreciate mixing things up between playthroughs, but you have to remember that the reason this is even happening is because of just how inconsistent the difficulty feels. Regarding my own experience, it's impossible to even fully understand just what it is that's generated these massive fluctuations in difficulty, given just how many times I've played through this game across so many characters, both on fresh saves and in New Game Plus. I understand that difficulty is very subjective, of course. Maybe other people found it to be more consistent than I have, but for the life of me, the mid-game of Elden Ring is just impossible to accurately gauge the difficulty of. Elden Ring's mid-game doesn't feel like a cemented experience for you to test your various builds against, so much as it feels like a mold you're constantly seeing changed indirectly based on your many choices regarding build optimization and the rate at which you happen to be progressing. It also doesn't help that there are so many potential encounters the player may come across, which are specifically made to be taken on at a higher level. So even if you somehow manage to have identical experiences across multiple characters, that in itself wouldn't change the lack of balance between these areas regardless. The strongest examples I can think of would undoubtedly be the Blackblade Kindred and the Flying Dragon Grail in Caelid, which grossly overshadow Radahn, this area's main boss mind you, and a demigod, one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful character in the game, besides literal eldritch horrors in terms of sheer difficulty. Make no mistake, Radahn is no pushover. In fact, I'd say that his difficulty feels pretty consistent regardless of what kind of character you're running, thanks to the structuring of the fight itself, but the fact that there are two significantly harder bosses in the very same area of the map, both of which, by the way, are not even named characters, at least not in the same vein as Radahn or Melania, is absolutely mind-boggling to me. The Blackblade Kindred in particular is not even meant to be fought until the late game, despite just how quickly you can encounter this enemy. Now sure, you could fight it in the mid-game, and it's not at all impossible to beat. Hell, that's actually what I did in either my first or second playthrough. I can't quite remember which one. But the difficulty is extremely skewed against you, to say the least. One enemy that stands out in a really weird way, though, is the Sleeping Dragon, which I'm convinced only exists to give the player a nice stock of runes fairly early on in the game. This one it's just really strange. So in Caelid, you'll reach an area called Grail's Dragon Barrow, which is filled with smaller dragons that are pretty damn imposing. Needless to say, Torrent. Towards the end of the area, though, is a massive dragon, one of the largest in the game, if not the largest, and taking it on from the front is basically Sewer Slide. Am I even allowed to say the real thing anymore? Or at least it is for an early to mid-game character build. However, if you go behind it, you can just wail away at it until it finally croaks, because despite how imposing and threatening it is, the poor thing is stuck in place and there are no dragons at its backside that can defend it. It takes some time, but once you kill it, the dragon will drop a whopping 74,000 runes, which can net you quite a few levels depending on how early you decide to find this thing. I don't even know what to say, like, I want to be appreciative of the fact that there's a way to basically gift yourself a surge in levels this early on, but the fact that it comes from such a massive and seemingly threatening enemy that's actually just a total punching bag feels weirdly wrong. It feels like something straight out of Lost Izalith, like they had an idea but either ran out of time or resources and so opted to leave it as it was. Like, I can't be the only one who gets this impression, surely someone else had this thought. But even with all of its issues, I will say that Caelid is easily one of the most interesting sections of the map, given just how much there is to talk about. There's also the dragons, the putrid avatars, the Halig Tree Knights, the lesser kindreds of rot, the weirdly malformed animals. It's honestly jam-packed with so many different kinds of enemies, and they all vary in their difficulty. Unfortunately, they also vary quite heavily in their quality. So yeah, Caelid is something of a mixed bag. Unfortunately, I don't retain nearly as many positive things to say about Liurnia of the Lakes, though, which I unfortunately found to be pretty awful. Liurnia of the Lakes, and Raya Lucaria by extension, honestly don't have a single quality enemy of note. The majority of them are either complete and total pushovers, or enemies that are so frustrating to fight that most players will just opt to run past them, and oh dear God, who could blame them? There's the giant sniping crayfish, which fire hard-hitting projectiles with extreme accuracy over a very long range and have a relatively large health pool. There's the sorcerers of Raya Lucaria, who just spam their magic the moment you enter their line of sight. Oh yeah, and then there's the zombies, which just rush you down in packs for a command grab that drains both health and magic. These plants, which spam homing lasers. FromSoft's signature dogs, which have yet to see any kind of change or improvement since they debuted in Demon's Souls back on the PS3, despite being one of the most annoying enemies From has ever designed. Oh, and who can forget the marionette soldiers, which are simultaneously very easy to kill, but also really annoying to even engage with in the first place. Regarding Liurnia of the Lakes specifically, it honestly feels like the intention was for the player to just run past the majority of enemies, given how wide and flat the level is. This is also exemplified by the glintstone dragon Smarag? I don't know. Another dragon boss which stands before a key item needed to enter Raya Lucaria. So in traditional Souls games, you would have to beat the boss to acquire whatever it is that they're guarding. It was a pretty simple rule of thumb that the player understood and would need to abide by. However, you can just walk right past the glintstone dragon, take the key, and run away before it even has a chance to attack you. That seems, That seems a little counterintuitive, don't you think? Like, this can't just be me. Not having to fight a boss, let alone a dragon, feels like a pretty big reward, so you would think that it would require you to do a bit more than holding forward on the analog stick, tapping triangle, and then holding back on the analog stick, or using the W and S keys. It's also worth bearing in mind that if we're assuming the player has seen every area south of Liurnia, this would be their 4th time seeing one of these dragon bosses, and it is far from the last time that they'll be seeing it either. I've already talked about Elden Ring's problem with recycling enemies, and I am going to be talking about it more so later, but it really is baffling just how many times a single enemy can be reused. And it is worth noting that Agheel was a really fun surprise to see in Limgrave, but none of the Echo Dragons beyond it, at least up to this point, feel anywhere near as creative. I can understand reusing a standard dragon enemy throughout the open world, and I can appreciate how so many of them utilize a unique form of damage and even status afflictions, but there is something really off-putting about the way From took these enemies and just stapled on a boss health bar and a generic background track. I don't think I would have minded these enemies nearly as much if they weren't presented as bosses, and honestly that goes for a lot of the game's minor bosses, but I'll hold off on that for now. One aspect of Elden Ring that I have grown quite fond of though is the Frenzied Flame. Even putting the fascinating lore aside, I honestly think the Frenzied Flame encounters are among the best, or at the very least most engaging encounters in the game. Having to navigate a level whilst carefully avoiding standing in the field of view of this totally not Eye of Sauron made for a far more engaging challenge than the typical running between areas and killing whatever stood in my way until I reached a boss that I spent 90% of the fight watching do insane combos. The Frenzied Flame applies a unique status affliction called Madness, which works more or less like that of Frenzy from Bloodborne, ironically enough. After building up so much of it, you'll take a hit to both your health and magic. Bear in mind this affliction can build up very quickly, so staying out of sight from the Dark Lord himself is both immediate and pressing from the moment that you start these encounters. I honestly love these encounters, and I can't wait to talk more about the Frenzied Flame when we get to the lore section of this critique. As far as Mount Gelmir is concerned, the only real challenge I think stems from the gaps between Sites of Grace, which, in fairness, I actually think makes for an acceptable challenge. Enemies aren't particularly difficult at Mount Gelmir. Sure, the Omen Slayers and the Iron Virgins can be tough, but nothing is just gonna outright one-shot you in the blink of an eye. The Mage Serpents in particular can become quite the nuisance if they're not dispatched of quickly because they do have a wide variety of attacks, some of which you are going to want to avoid dealing with. Not because they're annoying, thankfully, but just because they are dangerous. As long as you're smart about not letting yourself get overwhelmed and not running out of resources, they can prove to be quite manageable. Inside the volcano, most of the enemies you encounter are going to be the Man Serpents, however, they're comparatively much easier to dispatch of, but you also need to be mindful not to let yourself get lured into a trap or an ambush. We all know that gang fights suck, but I think having them be initiated by reckless play is a fair form of punishment, and it does feel like that was intentional with the Man Serpents in Volcano Manor. Before we get to Lindell Capital, there's also the issue of the surrounding area of the capital outskirts. This whole chunk of the map is honestly kinda terrible. The west end of the level is essentially farmland populated with midsummer larpers that don't really pose any kind of challenge. Then just to the right is a massive crater crawling with these worm face enemies, which honestly wouldn't be too bad were it not for their insta-kill status affliction. It was dumb in Dark Souls, and it's dumb in Elden Ring. And then there's the Lindell Capital Gates and the immediate surrounding territory. This section of the map is littered mostly with generic soldiers, however there are also catapults to fend you off as you approach, and once you arrive you'll find yourself being subjected to a boss gauntlet of sorts, which, not gonna lie, just feels really lazy. Like, you'd think they'd be able to do something a bit more creative with a massive staircase than just throwing an enemy onto it, whose attacks don't even line up well with this slanted level geometry. Like, guys, come on. I really have no idea why this area in particular is so flooded with bosses. There's the Tree Sentinel duo, the Draconic Tree Sentinel, the Valiant Gargoyle, Margit. Wait, what? The Falling Star Beast, and at night there's the Nazgul LARPing Knights Cavalry. But like I said, this area is downright cluttered with bosses to the point that they basically happen back to back non-stop up to the Draconic Tree Sentinel, and the whole area just feels really lazy as a result. Why construct an interesting level with well-crafted encounters and unique dangers when you can just copy and paste the Tree Sentinel half a dozen times over? Oh, yeah, and why is Margit here? We finally arrived at the Lindell Capital. We're now in the late game, kinda. And this one is really weird to talk about because, as I've mentioned before, I actually think this is one of the best designed dungeons in the game. Unfortunately, the enemy set here is pretty mixed, to say the least. The worst enemies don't ruin the level, but they definitely don't do it any favors either. Enemies in Lindel range from being pretty damn tough to bordering on complete jokes, and it doesn't feel like there's anything to enable an ebb and flow when going from one to the other. The oracles, the broken statues, the standard soldiers, they're all very common in Lindel, and they feel almost like punching bags that are just there to give you something to kill in between the tougher fights. I will say I enjoyed the Guardians, not because they're particularly interesting enemies, but having them placed on these narrow walkways made for a far more interesting challenge than they otherwise would have given on a regular flat plane. I will say that the Lindel Knights are actually among my favorite enemies in the game, but unfortunately they're the only tougher enemies throughout Lindel that I find myself really enjoying. The Air Tree Avatar shows up, again. There's another Valiant Gargoyle, because why not?
Actually, Loveless, the lore says
I don't give a fuck what the lore says, it's like the 5 billionth recycled enemy. Can they not come up with a lore reason to put in a unique enemy? I don't know. Yeah, on my first playthrough, it was around this point that I was beginning to realize just how much Elden Ring relies on recycling content, and it does the game no favors as far as I'm concerned. Elden Ring's mid-game was already beginning to show cracks in enemy design, especially by the time of reaching Lindel, but oh man, does it take a nosedive in quality from this point on. Beyond Lindel lies the Mountaintops of Giants, and it's around here where you'll begin to find enemies not only being heavily recycled, but also being grossly overtuned so as to artificially inflate the difficulty. Now, in fairness, the Mountaintops of Giants doesn't actually start off that bad. The Warriors of Zaymor are a pretty cool and not to mention damn tough enemy, and they don't feel unfair to fight. The crossing of the bridge while being under fire from the giant golem is memorable for the visual alone, and even though it is yet another dragon boss being copy-pasted, I really enjoy the fight with Borealis the Freezing Fog. It starts with you riding into this massive flat plane of ice, then suddenly a fog appears making it difficult to see very far ahead. Within the fog is the ice dragon Borealis, and defeating him will cause the fog to dissipate. Not only does this make running past him more difficult, which this game really needed more of, but it also incentivizes fighting him to begin with beyond the obvious reward of the soul. Runes. I honestly believe that if they'd bothered to give the other Echo Dragons proper gimmicks like this to distinguish themselves from one another, it would have more than made up for the fact that they are a recycled enemy. This is how you do a repeat boss, though I'd still prefer if it wasn't classified as a boss at all, but hey, that is ultimately a nitpick. If it was a well-designed encounter, it's a well-designed encounter, whether it's a boss or not. Unfortunately, Borealis is more of an exception than the rule. Also, unfortunately, is the fact that beyond Borealis, things begin to take an immediate, and not to mention rough, nosedive. Hey guys, you remember the Air Tree Avatar? I imagine so, given just how many times you've likely encountered them at this point. Here's 2 of them. Have fun. It's really weird. Elden Ring's early and mid-game both featured a sort of standard enemy to act as the lowest level challenge for that section of the game. These typically included the soldiers, knights, sometimes demi-humans, you get the idea. They were all jobber enemies meant to act as a sort of ground zero for the difficulty to start escalating. But it's around this point in the game where you won't be seeing too many more of these, and those that do are often either grossly overtuned or swarming you with their sheer numbers. The remainder of the Mountaintops of Giants, however, primarily consists of the large malformed dogs, frost trolls, the finger creepers, and the flame monks and guardians. The frost trolls and the flame monks and guardians seem alright at first, but it's around the point that you take so much as a single hit that you're going to be realizing just how wacky things are getting. The finger creepers are the worst offenders here by far, though. These things just feel like walking hitboxes. They deal insane damage, and they also stagger the shit out of you as well. They give off a sort of bumper car effect where they just kind of slide up to you and boop you over and over, and it can get pretty aggravating after a while. Yet another enemy that is not even worth engaging with. Seriously, just run right past it to the nearest grace. It's not worth the headache. The Mountaintops of Giants also feature an area known as Castle Sol just off to the side that is plagued with some of the worst late-game enemies to be found in this game. Sure, it's possible to encounter these enemies early on, but this is the point in the game, remember, where these enemies become noticeably more common, and their stats are noticeably cranked. There's the Lion Guardians, which on their own serve as a more than challenging enough foe, but for some reason they've been given the Tree Sentinel treatment, also known as the Dragon Rider treatment, also known as the Air Tree Avatar treatment, of being double copy-pasted into a relatively cramped area, making for an absurdly difficult challenge to even survive, let alone conquer. Thankfully they don't respawn, but bloody Christ they are annoying. Then there's the Spectral Banished Knights, and oh dear God, these things are unadulterated cancer. Hey, you know what sounds fun? Night enemies that can fly around and dish out combos straight out of Redgrave. Yeah, that'll be a tough opponent. Yeah, well, you know what? Congratulations, Elden Ring. This enemy is indeed quite hard. Unfortunately, being hard is not synonymous with being good. Turns out, making an enemy deal ridiculously high damage while also possessing multi-hit combos and blistering speed isn't all there is to designing a difficult foe. Who knew? I mean, what can I really say that will illustrate just how nonsensical this enemy is better than the gameplay itself? And I gotta say, cramming two of them into a room with an already quite tough boss just comes off as some of the most insufferably laziest game design that I've ever seen. The game would seriously be better off if they were just patched out altogether.
Oh, come on, Loveless, you're just mad because bad. They're hard, so you think they're bad. That's all there is to it.
Who the fuck? Who is it? What? I should kick your fucking ass. Who is this?
Look, y'all, I ain't gonna sugarcoat it, okay? I've beaten this game over a dozen times. I don't find it hard anymore. You don't get to use the mad 'cause bad excuse, okay? If I am bad at the game, then that means Elden Ring can be beaten a dozen times over by someone who's bad at it. So do you really want to go down that route? After the Mountaintops of Giants is Far Missoula, and while I could talk about the Dragonkin soldiers, instead, I want to bring the focus onto one enemy in particular, that being the Crucible Knight. This enemy actually appears throughout many locations, early, mid, and late game, sometimes even as a boss, because of course it does. The Crucible Knight is sort of Elden Ring's equivalent to the Black Knights from Dark Souls. They are really imposing, and they have this badass aura to them that's impossible to deny. When I first fought these things, I'd even go as far as to say they were among my favorite enemies in the game. Then From decided that they should get a power-up, and in my particular case, it just so happened that I didn't even know about this power-up's existence until I got to Far Missoula. Now the Crucible Knight has a phase 2, because of course it has a phase 2. Everything has a phase 2. Now it can fly, it has a tail that it can use to staple an extra hit onto the end of its combos. Oh yeah, it's a lot harder, sure, yeah. Sure. And hey, don't forget, this is Elden Ring's endgame, so here in Far Missoula, enemies are now dealing a crap load more damage than they were before. Not only can this lead to an unfair punish and a cheap death, but it just feels so tacked on and forced, like they didn't think the Crucible Knight was good enough on its own. And I'll stand by it, the Crucible Knight's first phase on its own as an enemy is great. It's terrific. It's one of Elden Ring's best enemies. Then it gets the phase 2, and suddenly it's garbage. Moving over to the Consecrated Snowfield, there's the invisible Black Knife Assassins, which have a grab that deals ridiculous damage and only serve to expose how bad the combat can get without lock-on. More Albinoric Archers, which deal massive amounts of damage and stagger while also being able to fire off multiple arrows at once and also quite rapidly. And then there's the Vulgar Militiamen, which despite their size, can easily kill you in a single combo and sometimes even just a single hit, because of course they can. But the fun doesn't stop there. There's also Mikula's Halig Tree, which reuses, as I've said, just about every enemy in the game, from common soldiers to the Air Tree avatars, to the Royal Revenants, to the Giant Ants, the Oracles, the Misbegotten, the Lesser Kindreds of Rot, the Crystallians. I just, like, why? So many, why? Oh, and don't even get me started on the late game optional dungeons. Remember those little annoying stone imps? Yeah, well, guess what? Now they deal quadruple damage, as does every other basic enemy you've been seeing for dozens of hours up to this point.
Well, Loveless, it's because they're built different.
You know what? You got me there. You may be able to kill demigods with the power to rearrange the cosmos, but you'll be damned if those spooky, scary Skellos don't kill you with a single combo from their gank brigade. It really is just ludicrous how many assets Elden Ring's late game reuses and just lazily cranks the stats on. Like, I'm sorry if it feels like I've repeated this point multiple times, but you have to realize just how hard it is to avoid talking about this particular topic when it is, in fact, most of what the late game ultimately comes down to. But at this point, I think I've said enough about Elden Ring's enemies. Elden Ring has a major problem when it comes to its enemy design, with the early game being mostly fine, albeit with its peaks and valleys, but the mid-game suffering from a noticeable dip in quality, and finally the endgame, which caps off as a bloated, reused, and overtuned set that rarely pose a legitimate challenge, barring certain exceptions like Borealis, which are just terrific. But I suppose talking about Borealis makes for a decent segue into what I'm sure we all know is Elden Ring's truest appeal, that being none other than bosses. This is a section that I have been itching to get to because there is honestly so much to talk about when it comes to Elden Ring's bosses. I'll go ahead and tell you all now, this is going to be the longest section by far, so get your popcorn and snowcaps ready because it's about time we got down to it. In fact, the script for the boss section turned out so long I had to divide it into 4 sections. Those sections being recycled bosses, the good bosses, the bad bosses, and the oh so ugly. So yeah, we're finally there. We're finally gonna really start talking about the bosses. I'm sure you're as eager as I am. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention. The basilisks from Dark Souls also return. That's pretty neat.